Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's a nice, bright, early morning once again. And it's time for us to do another podcast. So before we get into that, let's plug our stuff first, shall we? I stream daily and do these weekly podcasts live at twitch.tv/DJ_funky_fresh. Everything on Twitch ends up on YouTube at youtube.com/DJFunkyFreshGaming. And of course, you can find these podcasts at Spotify or SoundCloud. Just look for Funky Bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast and you got it. So, anyway, today's series is going to be over Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is a series that has been around since like 1988. When the first Final Fantasy came out in 1988. And I mean, the last big main series game came out in 2017 with Final Fantasy 15. And then, of course, we got a remake of 7, which came out this year, 2020. And, of course, they've already announced Final Fantasy 16, which is coming out probably within the next 2 years, so 2021, 2022. So, it's been a very long series. Like, 34 years. 32 years at this point. And I love it. This series is just something that really just has anything for anyone. And we're going to kind of go through it. We're going to go over Final Fantasy as a whole. And then we'll kind of jump into each of the individual games if I can. And then from there, we will figure out what we want to do. Because there's also all of the sub-series games. Such as, like, the non-main games. And oh boy, are there a lot of those, too. But that might have to be a separate game. Or separate podcast. And of course we can do that as is. So let's start with just Final Fantasy as a whole. It is very long emotive. But yes, it is amazing. So the fact that it's been going on for 32 years is not that surprising. Even though, fun fact, it was called Final Fantasy because it was supposed to be the series' last game. It's like, or not the series, it was supposed to be the game studio's last game. It was the Final Fantasy. "32 years later, and they still have not gotten their Final Fantasy." Alright, so Final Fantasy is a video game franchise developed and published by Square Enix. It is a JRPG series with varying gameplay settings and stories between each installment, retaining plot and gameplay elements throughout, focusing on fantasy and sci-fi settings. Though the core series is a RPG franchise, it has branched into other genres such as MMORPGs, tactical role-playing games, ARPGs, and fighting games. The series has been distributed on many platforms, beginning with the NES. And including consoles, computers, mobile game, phones, and game streaming services. The series has also branched into other forms of media, particularly films, novels, and manga. The majority of the games are standalone stories with unique characters, scenarios, settings, though several spin-offs and sequels to main series games continues the stories within the same worlds. The series is defined by its recurring gameplay mechanics, themes, and features. Commonly recurring features include the series' mascot creature, the Chocobos, that are often used as steeds, a character named Sid, who is usually associated with engineering, Moogles, cute flying creatures that often aid the player by facilitating some manner of in-game mechanics, the mythology-based summoned creatures that can be called forth to aid players in battle and are also commonly fought as bosses, the job system, whereby playable characters are defined by their unique job classes, and the active time battle system, an evolution of the classic turn-based style common in early JRPGs where a unit's speed determines how many actions they can take. The series plot tend to focus on a group of characters from various backgrounds who team up to save the world while dealing with their own struggles and fighting a central antagonist whose goal is usually world destruction. Names, designs, and spells are often based on real-world mythologies, religions, and cultures. The series is Square Enix's flagship franchise and their best-selling video game series with 130 million units sold, as well as revenue earned through mobile releases and MMO subscriptions, and has made an impact in popular culture, particularly for popularizing the console RPG genre outside of Japan. Its critically acclaimed orchestral musical scores, memorable and likable characters, realistic and detailed graphics, and innovative mechanics have made the franchise notable in the industry. So, let's jump into the gameplay. Final Fantasy series usually puts the player in control of multiple characters in a party, though there are exceptions. The player will build the party's strength by gradually acquiring new abilities and equipment to handle more powerful opponents. In many games, this task extends beyond the main story with challenging super bosses and bonus dungeons serving as optional tests of skills. As a JRPG, many installments, particularly the earlier installments in the main series, or the throwback spin-offs returning to old formulas, involve frequent use of menus to select item skills and upgrades. So, battle systems have varied, with the majority being menu-based with variants on turn-based combat, though others use action-based combat systems. Earlier installments have instanced battles based on random encounters while roaming the world map, while some later games, beginning with FF12, they have free roaming enemies that are engaged without transition. Battle commands typically feature a basic physical attack with the equipped weapon, a magic skill set, or other special command abilities like steal or throw or summoning, and a set of items, though the player may also try to flee from many normal encounters. The characters normally have HP and MP stats. Most games also feature elements and status effects, nuances which can affect the course of battle, with enemies and allies using them to attack and exploit each other's weaknesses and or to defend themselves, as well as to prepare for an upcoming encounter. However, the best known and widely used battle system is the ATB, the Active Time Battle, pseudo-turn-based system introduced in Final Fantasy IV, where characters can perform an action when their ATB gauge is full. The fill rate is affected by stats, status effect, abilities used, and other factors requiring the player to be economical with time. Many games feature a variant of this system. As an early example, Final Fantasy XII uses the Active Dimension Battle system to determine the rate at which characters will perform actions input through menus or the Gambit system. There are no random encounters, and the player can move the character around the field and must be within the range of the enemy they are using their skill on. Yes, we all remember the Gambit system now, don't we? Oh god, 12 was a nightmare to learn the first time. The Final Fantasy series has also featured a more basic traditional turn-based system, such as the original Final Fantasy through to Final Fantasy III, that do not rely on time, but the player and the enemy party take turns executing commands. Final Fantasy X features a conditional turn-based battle system where turns are taken based on the act list, the turn ordered depending on the unit's stats and statuses, and commands being ranked usually with stronger commands having longer recovery times until the unit can act again. Outside of turn-based systems, the series has occasionally featured purely action-based combat systems in which the skills the players use are similar to traditional skill sets of attack, magic, spells, special abilities, and items, but the rate the characters can use these depends on player skills with less reliance on menus. The first in the series with an ARPG focus is 15, though many spin-offs such as Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core and Final Fantasy Type 0 have used these systems before. So, yeah, the ARPG is definitely, as you could tell from my gameplay of 15 yesterday, as well as the remake, ARPG seems to be the style it's going towards. What with 13 probably being the last of the ATB system, most likely. Sad, but, happens. So, character growth determines how player characters learn new abilities and boost their stats. Unlike battle systems, character growth systems are less consistent throughout the series, and players must internalize the systems to make the correct decisions. The only consistent character growth mechanic used in the series has been the level-based system, where characters raise their level through experience points earned in battle to improve their stats and sometimes learn abilities. Even this system has been excluded from such games, such as in Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XIII, where only ability points are accumulated from battles that can be expended for both better stats and new skills. And completely ignored in Final Fantasy XIII, where you only get stats for doing quests. There was no level up system. In 13.3, Lightning Returns. One of the most common and familiar systems that determines character growth is the job system. A class-based system where players assign characters a job, choosing from series staples such as the Black Mage, the White Mage, the Monk, the Thief, and the Warrior, among many others, of course. The character's job determines their base abilities and the stats gained. Throughout early games, this was often through experience, though Final Fantasy V introduced ability points as a separate system where the experience would increase a level independent of the job. And the ability points likewise accumulated from battles from battles are used to grow the job's abilities. Many games featuring the job system allow the player to switch the jobs around to learn new abilities or face new enemies, though some, such as the original Final Fantasy, stick the job as fundamental to the character. Similarly, games such as Final Fantasy IX do not have named job systems, but the characters have defined roles similar to the job system with predetermined abilities that they can learn. But of course, also with 9, you can supplement that with many other things. Many games offer different systems to allow more freedom when growing characters' abilities and stats, beginning as early as Final Fantasy II. I believe Final Fantasy II, you grew abilities and stats just by using certain weapons. So you gained skills in unarmed combat by fighting fisticuffs. You earned points with shields by using shields, swords, etc., etc. Often this features a mix of the ability point system, in which points are used to grow abilities without being determined by a job. One of the popular systems is the Materia System, featured in Final Fantasy VII and other games in its subseries, where the player equips characters with materia that contain various commands or support abilities, and accumulating ability points allows the materia to grow and gain stat boosts and new abilities. Similarly, the Mage featured in Final Fantasy VI allow the player to equip Magicite remains of Espers with the accumulated ability points, allowing the characters to learn the magic spells they contain, and once reaching a certain threshold, the characters learn the ability to permanently use it without the equipped Magicite. This way, the player can directly control which party members use which skills and customize their party to their preferred play style. Other games in the series deviate further from the typical formula. Final Fantasy XII has players learn license points, a variation of the ability point systems, to spend on a license board to purchase licenses to wield different equipment, use different spells, and boost their stats with total freedom. In the International Zodiac Job System re-release, the license boards are based on jobs. In Final Fantasy X, characters learn abilities based on a sphere grid that begins linearly, not literally, but the players can eventually branch the grid out further and potentially max all stats with various items usable to alter and improve spear grid growth. Another example featuring items for growing skills is Final Fantasy VIII, where magic spells are collected into an inventory similar to items and acquired through refine or draw abilities, with other abilities learned via ability points from the character's equipped guardian forces. It's funny that you like the sphere grids, because a lot of people dislike the sphere grids a lot. They dislike the sphere grids, they dislike the license board, they miss just the whole gain points, your character gains skills, and you can change your jobs whenever you want. So you know exactly what you're growing into, how you're growing into it. But that's just what some people thought about it. But, some games will click more for others. So, equipment. Typically, characters can equip armor, weapons, and accessories, where armor provides defensive boosts, weapons determine the strength and type of attack used, and accessories provide various supporting abilities or bonuses. There are rarely optimal sets of armor or accessories, though many games feature ultimate weapons for each character, often involving side quests to obtain them. Games can deviate from the standard format. Final Fantasy VI features relics as accessories, while Final Fantasy VIII has neither accessories nor armors, all effects typically associated with gear being abilities instead. Many games feature specific types of armor, such as head armor, body armor, arm armor, and leg armor, while other games have a single set of armor based on the character, such as Final Fantasy VII or X. Armor can provide bonus abilities such as resistance to status effects or elements, and in some games, such as 9, are integral to the character growth systems, where characters can learn new skills by equipping gear. Yes, arm armor. Usually it's the gloves. That's what they typically call them. But yeah, I think the best use of armor has to be in 9, with the fact that armor is based around the acquisition of skills. You put this helm on, and after you've gained enough AP with this armor on, you suddenly gain its ability. Like, not only does it force you to try out new equipment to see what actually works for you, but you get rewarded for finding equipment by getting new skills, either while you're wearing it or while your character grows with it. So it has a huge, in my opinion, huge bonus to just the whole experiment and try. And if you don't like it, well, you gained a new ability, maybe. So, let's see, the field. Outside of battles, the player can explore the field for items, dialogue with NPCs, or for trading in guild for items and gear. In games featuring instanced random encounters, the player will encounter an enemy randomly while exploring dangerous areas, though abilities to reduce the encounter rate can be learned, while games with free roaming enemies have enemies appear in the dangerous areas for the player to engage or avoid. The players can explore dungeons where enemies are fought and treasure and items can be found. Enemies tend to be more numerous in dungeons, and there's often a boss at the end. Other areas are safe havens, notably towns, which contain shops for the party to buy new items and equipment, and often an inn to rest at and fully restore HP and MP. Many games feature a world map used to traverse on foot or via airships, chocobos, or other vehicles. World maps have random encounters and are crossed to reach other points of interest in the world, often with mountains and oceans and other impassable objects placed to ward off areas the player is not meant to visit yet. By endgame, players usually acquire a vehicle that allows exploration of every nook of the world. The field areas often feature NPCs and events that allow the player to play minigames for mandatory or non-mandatory rewards. The first minigames were introduced in the Gold Saucer of Final Fantasy VII. Yes, a mode of every nook and cranny, where the player can play various games including Chocobo Racing and the Battle Arena. Another notable minigame was the Dragon's Neck Coliseum in Final Fantasy VI, where the player can bet items for rewards and fight various enemies. Card minigames are also popular, particularly Triple Triad, introduced in Final Fantasy VIII, which has seen many iterations following the releases. Then, of course, there's the MMOs. Though the MMO releases of Final Fantasy XI and XIV are members of the main series, with the exception of some abilities, some equipment, and the job system, they deviate from the traditional gameplay format due to the nature as games of a different genre. The MMOs are free roaming, with enemies appearing on the field, rarely use traditional menu systems. Instead, abilities are selected from a player customized list and use various features typical of MMO games. Being multiplayer games, they include player interaction as well as trading between players. The player does not control a party, but multiple players can form one to fight in dungeons and against bosses. And of course, there's the spin-offs. So, the spin-offs gameplay can deviate a lot from the main series. While spin-offs tend to include gameplay fundamentals, if only in abilities and the names of the abilities, many stick to RPG elements. As an example, although Dissidia Final Fantasy and games following its formats are fighting games, they still feature character growth, characters using their specific abilities, and similar equipment systems. Another notable spin-off, Final Fantasy Tactics, is a tactical role-playing game with a job system that uses tactical unit command, as opposed to one of the battle system featured throughout the main series. Many games also feature action elements, such as Final Fantasy Type 0, while others include shooting elements, such as Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, but still keep the series fundamentals. Many spin-offs have been released on mobile platforms that use simplified forms of the typical battle system, such as Final Fantasy Record Keeper. Other games use collectible card gameplay, barely reminiscent of the main series. Final Fantasy has seen a lot of growth, a lot of change, a lot of everything throughout the ages, as they just explore and try new things. They'll see another series get kind of popular, and then they'll be like, I wonder if we can do that. And then they'll kind of branch into that a little bit, decide what works, what doesn't work, make it their own, etc., etc., etc. So Final Fantasy settings. The Final Fantasy series settings range from traditional fantasy to sci-fi. Each game focuses on one world that varied dramatically in backstory, technological advancement, and culture. Humans are the dominant sapient species, with chocobos, moogles, and several enemy species being the most commonly recurring non-human. The worlds often feature crystals that throughout early setting were magical phenomena fundamental to the elements of the world, but in others have different roles. Settings often contain elements based on real-world mythology, and the series features many allusions to religion. A notable example are ancient mythological creatures that function as summons and have various different roles within the game's lores. Espers from Final Fantasy VI are a magical race that once lived alongside humans until a war wiped most of them out. Aeons in Final Fantasy X are the physical realizations of the dreams of the faith, and summoners use them to battle Sin. Many games feature summoned monsters, do not have them as a named race, or give them a key role within the lore. The summons being merely abilities to be used in battle. The series often features other mythological references, such as Kefka, Palazzo, and Sephiroth's god forms, based on divinity as their final encounters in Final Fantasy VI and VII, respectively. The game worlds themselves are commonly based on real-world mythology, such as Final Fantasy X, and its Shinto and Buddhism influences, and the influence of Jewish mysticism in Final Fantasy VII. Each setting often features some form of magic, sometimes spelled with a K at the end, M-A-G-I-C-K, magic, though it often differs between the different lores. In many settings, magic is the power of the world's crystals, which is Final Fantasies 3, 4, and 5. Final Fantasy VI, magic has become a rarity, with many resorting to magitech, which is magical technology. And magic in FF7, magic is a product of the life stream and can be used via materia. The scientists have stated that magic is an unfitting term for a force of nature. And Final Fantasy XII, magic is provided by the mysterious substance known as mist that seeps from the inside of the planet. I got confused because mist is in 9 too. But no, yeah, that makes sense. Mist. Plots. The series' most basic plots revolve around the cast fighting an antagonist who aims to destroy or conquer the world while coping with their own struggles. The characters are often part of a small resistance against one or more larger powers, and each tend to have different motivations within their own groups. There's a sense of desperation. Excuse me with the yawns. There is a sense of desperation as the characters fight for everything they hold dear. I agree, Emotive. The mist thing was cool, both in 9 and in 12. The plots vary from being overly lighthearted, such as Final Fantasy 3 or 5, to being more grim and realistic, such as Final Fantasies 2 or 7, though many, such as 9 and 14, are kind of a mix of lighthearted and grim and realistic. For the first few key installments, a key plot point was the crystals. Each world would feature 4, each representing the 4 elements, and without them, the world would deteriorate. The antagonists often begin by destroying or stealing these crystals for power, and the party would fail to prevent them and be forced to foil their grander scheme later. This plot was abandoned in Final Fantasy VI, and while the games would still feature crystals, they often did not have the same importance. The crystal theme can be said to be the overarching theme of the series, as a traditional Final Fantasy plot involves an antagonistic force trying to make use of the crystal's power while the player power in opposition. Sometimes chosen to wield the crystal's power to enact their will as the Warriors of Light. Some games subvert this theme, such as 12, where the crystals are called Nethicite, and the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy series, with its various types of crystals, showing that the power of the crystals is not necessarily something that mankind should pursue despite its might. Themes. One key theme in the series is dualism, presented in many ways, such as through a contrast between 2 worlds, between 2 heroes/heroines, and between a protagonist and an antagonist. Most often, this dualism represents a balance that is disturbed by outside forces, forcing the protagonist to restore it. Other times, the balance set is deemed unjust by the protagonist, and they must instead end the cycle to free the world. Another common theme is rebellion. The protagonists are often forced to fight a higher power, either on a quest for revenge or freedom, or another motivation. The higher power can range from an empire, such as the Gestalian Empire from 6, a religion, such as Yevon in 10, or a deity, such as the Falsies in 13. During the journey to vanquish these powers, their threat escalates until the protagonists free the world of the oppressors. Sometimes they don't get it done before things get destroyed. So, background. Let's get the background development of Final Fantasy, shall we? During the mid-1980s, Square Co. Limited entered the video game industry by developing games for the Nintendo Famicom. In 1986, Enix released the first Dragon Quest game and popularized the RPG genre in Japan, after Western games such as the Wizardry series introduced them to Japanese audiences. Coupled with Nintendo Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest was one of the defining games of the Famicom system. Think about that. The original Dragon Quest, along with Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, those were the top 3 defining games on the Famicom. And look at where all of them are now. Dragon Quest, unfortunately, is not as popular anymore, but it's still up there. Mario's never going away. Zelda's never going away. And Final Fantasy's kind of taken up that gauntlet away from Dragon Quest. Square had been developing simple RPGs, pseudo 3D games, and racing games, although they failed to compete with the market and did not perform well commercially. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team grew pessimistic at the failures as the company faced bankruptcy, so he began to develop the RPG Final Fantasy as a personal, final project to leave a legacy. If the game had sold poorly, he would have quit the industry to return to university. Sakaguchi wanted the game to have a simple abbreviation in the Roman alphabet, FF, and a 4-syllable abbreviated Japanese pronunciation, FU. Fantasy was chosen due to the setting, though Final was originally intended to be fighting, so it was supposed to be Fighting Fantasy, and was changed to avoid conflict with the tabletop game Fighting Fantasy. Though Final Fantasy was released at a time when competing games such as Sega's Phantasy Star and Dragon Quest III were released, it pulled Square out of its financial crisis, and when released 3 years later in North America, outsold several of its peers. As Final Fantasy had not been planned with a sequel in mind, Final Fantasy II was developed in a new world separate to the first, with new characters designed by Yoshitaka Amano and given a deeper story to match competitors such as Phantasy Star 2. Although not the first game to be released outside of America, Final Fantasy VII was the first overseas to popularize the series and the JRPG genre. That's why Final Fantasy VII is considered to be so successful in defining for the series, is because it's what launched it internationally as a beloved series to everybody. Although the game is still the best-selling game in the series, with over 11 million units sold between its original release and subsequent re-release, the series has continued to find financial success since and has become the company's best-selling franchise worldwide. From the very beginning, Final Fantasy was the fruit of a team effort to compete with games like Dragon Quest or Mario Bros., both of which showed the presence of highly talented individuals. Sakaguchi realized Square would need to aggregate the energies of multiple people, growing into a tradition of sorts. Working as a team enabled the incorporation of CG into the game. Sakaguchi has lamented that if Final Fantasy had been more of a solo effort, the series might have looked quite different. So the character design. Character concept artwork was handled by Yoshitaka Amano, from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy VI, who also handled logo and promotional image designs for games to follow. He was replaced by Tetsuya Nomura from Final Fantasy VII onwards, with the exception of 9, who was handled by Shuko Murasi, Toshiyuki Itahana, and Shin Nagasawa, and Final Fantasy XII, where it was handled by Akihiko Yoshida. Gameplay systems were originally based on those seen in RPGs, released at the time the series was developed. The many systems which would become series staples were designed by Hiroyuki Ito. Ito developed systems such as the ATB system, inspired by Formula One racing, the concept of different character types being able to overtake each other. Ito refined the job system in 5 to become the system used frequently throughout the series, and designed the Gambit system for 12. Other systems, such as the Materia System in 7, were designed as a group effort and was designed so the combat changed depending on how the materia was used, as opposed to characters having innate skills. Toshiro Tsuchida would design systems for other games, such as the removal of the ATB in Final Fantasy X to replace with the conditional turn-based, and later designed the Command Synergy battle system, which 13 used, to make battles appear visually impressive, as in the movie Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Yes, there is a movie of Final Fantasy VII called Advent Children. The MMO gameplay systems have been drastically different, but mostly drawn inspiration from a mix of Final Fantasy games and from other games in its genre. Stories have been worked on as a collaborative effort from multiple developers, with concepts having drawn inspiration from multiple sources. In the early gameplays, Sakaguchi drew inspiration from anime filmmaker Miyazaki, and staples such as chocobos and airships originally derived from them. Think about that. Our favorite chocobos were inspired by Miyazaki. Furthermore, many have noted similarities between the series and Star Wars, present in references such as Biggs and Wedge, and in recurring plot points such as an Empire. The series contains many darker themes of tragedy and loss, many inspired by the developer's own experiences. While developing Final Fantasy VII, the series creator Sakaguchi's mother died. which caused him to drastically reform the game's story to be about coping with loss. The series has had multiple directors. Sakaguchi directed the first 5. Yoshinori Kitase and Ito collaboratively directed 6, and the two went on to direct many of the later installments on their own. Ito directed 9 and 12, while Kitase developed 7, 8, and 10. After 10, Kitase decided to stop directing, but remained involved as a producer instead, choosing Motomu Toriyama as the director of 13 and its sequels. The Mmo Releases have had multiple directors, though most notably Naoka Yoshida has directed 14. Hiyami Tabati started with directing spin-off games for portable gaming systems with Before Crisis 7 and Crisis Core 7, but when Final Fantasy Versus 13 became Final Fantasy 15, Tabata took over the role of director. So yeah, Final Fantasy 15 was supposed to be Final Fantasy Versus 13. So that's kind of interesting. Gosh, it's so weird. I remember in high school seeing a gameplay trailer for 15. I was just like, this is amazing! And then I didn't play it until I got to law school. Granted, it didn't come out until 2016, so I couldn't have played it until then. Anyway, music. The majority of the music in the series, including the main recurring themes and the full official soundtracks for the first 10 games in the series, was composed by Nobuo Uematsu and has been praised as one of the greatest aspects of the series. The music has had a broad musical palette, taking influences from classical symphonic music, heavy metal, and techno-electronica. Imagine going from classical symphonic music to techno-electronica. Yes, and then I didn't really play it until now. Each game typically features themes for different locations or types of locations, story events, characters, and battle themes. Typically a basic battle theme, boss battle theme, and a final battle theme. As a minimum, with some special bosses having their own battle themes. There are many recurring themes, such as the Chocobo themes, associated with the series' mascot creature, main series themes that has often played in the intro or ending credits, the victory fanfare that concludes one battles, Prelude, also known as the Crystal theme, that has become one of the series' most recognizable themes, and Battle at the Big Bridge, the boss battle theme of the recurring character Gilgamesh. Themes have often been rearranged for their appearances within different games to suit the various settings. From the beginning, Uematsu was given creative freedom. The series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi would request specific set pieces to fit themes, and early on there were specific notes Uematsu was unable to use due to hardware limitations. From Final Fantasy IV onwards, he had more freedom of instrumentation. For One Winged Angel, the Final Fantasy VII final boss theme, and the series' first vocalized theme, Uematsu combined both rock and orchestral influences, having had no prior training in orchestra conduction. And I do have to say, if you haven't listened to the actual, One Winged Angel theme, you should. The developers had originally planned to use a famous vocalist in the ending of Final Fantasy VII, but the plan didn't go through due to being too abrupt, and there were no suitable theme in the story for a vocal song to suddenly come up in the end. The idea was realized in Final Fantasy VIII with Eyes on Me, has a meaning in the plot, and it relates to the game's main characters. Uematsu went on to compose vocal theme songs for the main games of 9, 10, 12, and 14, even though he didn't otherwise participate with 12, its soundtrack being composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto. From 10 onwards, the series has had other composers, as Uematsu eventually left Square to go freelance, though he has continued to compose music for the series for as recent of the original 14. The soundtrack for 10 was a joint effort between Uematsu, Masashi Hamazu, and Junya Nakano. The music for Final Fantasy XII was mainly composed by Hitoshi Sakimoto, Masashi Hamazu, Masashi Hamazu did the soundtrack for 13, and Yoko Shimomura, who had previously composed the music for Square Enix's Kingdom Hearts, composed the music for 15. The composition's success has resulted in many side projects by Uematsu based on the music from the series. The Black Mages was a hard rock band that arranged and remixed music from the series. Other notable projects have included live orchestral tours, music from Final Fantasy, Final Symphony tours, and the Dear Friends music from the Final Fantasy tour. Many rearrangements and compilations have been released on the series' music, the piano collections being among the best known, with many games also having special orchestrated orchestrated albums whose compositions have been performed in the live orchestral tours. Official sheet music books have been released in Japan, usually for piano arrangements of the in-game soundtracks. So yeah, that's kind of FF as a whole. Shall we jump in and kind of just try to hit on the 16 games individually real quick? Oh, good. So, Final Fantasy 1. Final Fantasy, also known as Final Fantasy 1 in re-releases, is an RPG developed by Square Enix in Japan in December of 1987. And it was the first title in the Final Fantasy series. This game was released in North America in 1990 and has been re-released worldwide on the PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, PSP, iOS, Android, and many other platforms, with re-releases making modifications and adding new content. The game was directed by the game puts players in control of 4 characters known as the Warriors of Light, and begins by asking the players to select the classes and names of each. The Warriors of Light can traverse the maps of dungeons and towns, which are connected by the world map, and will run into random encounters with enemies or fight bosses. Battles are controlled using menus in a turn-based fashion, in which characters can use attacks or magic depending on the class they have equipped. Final Fantasy takes place in a fantasy medieval setting with 3 major continents, and the 4 Warriors of Light begin in Cornelia. They are tasked by the King of Cornelia to rescue Princess Sarah from Garland, and after defeating him, the king opens up a bridge, enabling them to pass to the town of Provoca. This sets them off on an adventure to defeat the 4 fiends and rescue the world. So, we're going to hit some of the basics. So, Final Fantasy begins by asking the players to select classes and names for each of the Warriors of Light. You can actually cheat by choosing specific names. Actually, the names you give determine your stats as well. Fun fact. Like most computer RPG games, the player characters are passive participants in the story. Thus, the player's choice for character class will only affect the abilities in battle. Like, for instance, if your character starts with the letter A and is only 3 out of 4 characters long, your character might have an extra boost in strength. If your character has 4 specific things, your character might max out their stats. So, your choices for your character class in this game is limited to Warrior, a specialist in heavy weapons and armor who can withstand punishment, will become the Knight, able to use the most powerful weapons and some white magic spells. There is the Monk, a martial artist who is best left fighting empty-handed, but may also wield nunchaku and the most basic of staves. Does tremendous damage in battle, but cannot wear heavy armor. Becomes the Master. In the original version, at a high level, a bare-handed Master who is unencumbered by armor can do more damage in a single attack than any other character type. A party of 4 Masters can defeat the final boss in less than 2 full rounds. Though a rather weak class in the beginning, the player never has to buy much equipment for them, thus saving Gil. There's the Thief, a high evasion accuracy finesse character with limited weapon and armor selection, but greater agility and luck, which is the ability to escape from combat. The ability to flee is bugged in versions before the Origins release. The Thief will be upgraded to the Ninja class, who can use almost every weapon and most armor, and can use many black magic spells. The White Mage, a specialist in white magic, not a good fighter, but can use hammers for physical attacks and focus on supporting the team with healing enhancement magics. Will be upgraded into a White Wizard, which allows the character to use the most powerful white magic spells. A Black Mage, a specialist in black magic, but is physically frail, becomes the Black Wizard who can cast Flare, or Nuke, in the original North America localization, one of the two most damaging spells that retain full effectiveness against the final boss. The White Wizard can cast Holy, but it is less powerful. And finally, there's the Red Mage, the jack of all trades, able to use most but not all white and black magic, and fights similar to, but not quite as well as, the fighter. Becomes the Red Wizard. So basically, yeah, that's basically what it is. You get 4 characters predetermined at the very beginning. It doesn't change, and yeah, that's kind of just how it goes. I will look into the re-releases of Final Fantasies 1 and 2 to see if we can't stream those as well, because they will be prettier and easier to play. Okay, Final Fantasy 2. This is the second installment of the Final Fantasy series. It was released in December of 1988 for the family computer, exclusively in Japan, but was later released for the PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, PSP, iOS, Android, and other platforms. This game centers on conflict with the Palamecian Empire, whose Emperor Mateus is using Hellspawn to try and conquer the world. The protagonist, Firion, along with his allies, Mariah and Guy, join the Wild Rose Rebellion to fight them, and meet many allies along the way to try to stop the Emperor and save the world. Final Fantasy II eliminates the leveling system from the previous game, focusing on the playable character stats, which increase according to how much they use. Focusing on playable character stats, which increase according to how much they are used or required. For example, a character who frequently casts magic would have their magic proficiency increase faster, while a character who frequently takes damage would have their maximum HP increase. Battles are fought turn-based systems seen in the previous game, though each character has their class and abilities defined. So, Final Fantasy II is unique in the series for not using experience-based levels. Instead of earning experience points at battles, each participant develops depending on what actions they take during battle. For example, characters who frequently use a particular type of weapon, sword, bow, axe, etc., will become more adept at wielding a weapon of that type, as well as increasing their physical strength. Similarly, characters who are frequently cast at a particular magic spell will learn to cast more powerful versions of that spell, as well as increasing their magical power. HP and MP decrease depending on need. A character who ends a battle in critical health may earn an increase in their maximum amount of hit points, and a character who expends a majority of their magic points during a single battle may increase their magic amount of magic points. Let's see. A handful of bugs related to this advancement system was present in the release version, the most notable being the ability to cancel a previously issued command and still gain the stat-increasing benefit of having performed the action. This was possible because the game's turn-based battle system gave the player the opportunity to input commands for all 4 party members at once. At any point before the command of the final character in the lineup was issued, the player could return to the previous character and reissue a command. Since many statistics, such as weapons and magic spell proficiency, were based on how many times a particular command was used in battle, a little patience meant it was possible to quickly advance in proficiencies in the space of a single battle round. A similar problem manifested in the way hit point increase were granted, which allowed characters to attack members of their own party to increase their maximum hit points. These problems were replicated in both the ports. The Game Boy Advance remake eliminated the command cancel bug, though the hit point increase trick remained. Various other changes were made to the GBA version, including regular hit point increases outside of those gained as outlined above, to decrease game difficulty. I can see why the fact that you have to like take damage in order to gain more health would be an issue. Because that just requires you to grind at low health, and just hope you don't die. So, battle parties can only consist up to 4 characters. 3 are present throughout the entire game, and the 4th position rotates. FF2 was the first game in the series to allow a friendly character to be placed in the back row during battles, making them immune to most physical attacks, but still harmed with bows and magic attacks. Enemies can be arranged in up to 4 rows of 2 characters each, for a maximum of 8 total hostile opponents at one time. Only the 2 rows closest to the player's party can be damaged with physical attacks. By eliminating the 2 closest rows, the player can then physically damage the other rows. When in conversation with NPCs, the players can learn special words or phrases which can later be repeated to other NPCs to gain information or unlock new actions. A handful of special items can be shown to NPCs that have the same effect. Yeah, 1 and 2 were very scary. Because you could just get party wiped. 1, you could have a total of like 9 to 12 enemies on screen attacking you in a row. So if you got unlucky and got a back attack on a full 12 enemy tile set, you would get hit 12 separate times before you got your first turn in. And if you were very slow and the characters were all fast, you would get hit 24 times before you got your first turn. That's if you are super unlucky. So, Final Fantasy II was also the first game in the series to have an actual main cast of characters with names and histories. Firion, Maria, and Guy are always in the party, while the first character changes throughout the story. You know, Firion is the main character, the adopted friend of Maria and Leon, and childhood friend of Guy. Maria is Firion and Guy's childhood friend and the female lead. She quests to find her brother Leon. Guy is a friend. He speaks in a stunted manner and can speak to animals. Leon is Maria's older brother. Minwu is a white mage. Joseph is a miner. Gordon is a prince. Layla is a pirate who attempts to rob the party. Richard Highwind is the last dragoon. And Scott is another prince. And the older brother of Gordon. So yeah, this is when they first started actually adding in. And as you remember, this is also where they were like, oh, we can actually get story, plot, characters. Because remember, that first game felt kind of weak and all, but that's because they're like, well, this is our only chance. And, well, that's... it might not work, you know. And now they're like, we can do this. This was loved. It's successful. They want more. So let's do more. Let's add to it. And that's what they've been so successful at doing. Adding to it. Making more. Exactly. And you just see as they're expanding. Like, even from jumping from 13 to 15. Oh my god, they expanded it majorly. So... good news, bad news. Good news, we might get 1 to 2 more podcasts out of just Final Fantasy. Because we're going to do Final Fantasies 3 through 16 next week. And then, heck, we might hit all the Final Fantasy sub-spin-offs, too. So, which, in and of itself, is like 30 games. Or so, give or take. Yes. So we're going to have a Final Fantasy month, it looks like. So, yeah, I think this is a good point. This is a good point to call it, and we can pick up next time, you know, right there. Final Fantasy is definitely one of those series that is near and dear to me. And it's something that I absolutely love and want to continue to see it grow and just become more and more popular. Like I do with Dragon Quest and all that. It's just, there's so much I want out of it. And there's so much we will get out of it. So I'm always super excited for it. So, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you all for listening, tuning in. That's all I have for us today. And I will see you all next week. I'm glad you all like having episodes like this where you can just listen to me talk about things I like, give you a bunch of background, and just hit things. You know, like you might have been like, I completely forgot what Final Fantasy X was about. Well, you're going to learn what X is about now. Actually, X is a bad example because that could be a lot of things. Final Fantasy Y is about. But anyway, thank you everybody for watching, listening, tuning in. I appreciate it. And until the next time, everybody, stay funky people.